The ocean does not care how much your ticket costs, nor does it care if you are a titan of industry or a child asleep in the dark. When the freezing white fog descends, blinding the eyes of desperate men, the sea simply becomes a hungry, ancient entity. And on a bitterly cold September afternoon in 1854, it swallowed the pride of a nation in absolute silence. But the true horror of that day was not the freezing water. It was the total, vicious collapse of human morality as the men sworn to protect the innocent stole the only means of escape. Welcome back to the dreamscape of history. If you find yourself captivated by the shadows of the past, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It is always a pleasure to know who is listening in the dark. Tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. Leave a comment down below with your thoughts on tonight's tragedy. Now, settle in, dim the lights, and let the cold water pull you under. Before the nightmare began, the SS Arctic was a marvel of the modern world. She was the third colossal vessel built for the Collins Line, a wooden paddle steamer launched in the bitter chill of January 1850. To step aboard her was to step into a floating palace. She was massive for her time, 2,856 tons of timber and iron, stretching 284 feet across the water. Her single black funnel stood like a monument against the sky, while her massive side-mounted paddle wheels churned the ocean into white foam. She was fast, brutally fast, earning the grand title of Clipper of the Seas. The Arctic was the pride of America, designed to crush her British rivals at the Cunard Line and dominate the treacherous North Atlantic route. But her beauty hid a fatal flaw, not in her construction, but in the greed and arrogance of the men who controlled her fate. To understand the doom of the Arctic, one must understand the invisible weight she carried long before she ever struck the water. The Collins Line was heavily subsidized by the United States government, and politicians in Washington, sitting safely in their warm, dry offices, demanded absolute perfection. They placed an impossible, lethal requirement upon the company. The ships were mandated to steam at full speed, at all times, no matter the weather, no matter the darkness, and no matter the blinding fog that haunts the northern shipping lanes. It was a reckless gamble with human life, born of national pride and corporate greed. The captains were effectively stripped of their caution, forced to drive their massive wooden titans blindly through the mist, hoping the ocean in front of them was empty. And for a few years, the gamble paid off. The Arctic was celebrated. Her first-class accommodations, known as the saloon class, were lavish beyond measure. There was no cramped steerage on this vessel. Even her second-class cabins were incredibly comfortable. Passengers dined in a grand saloon lined with polished mahogany, sipping fine wines and listening to music as the brutal ocean raged just inches away behind the thick glass portholes. The illusion of absolute safety was intoxicating. They felt entirely disconnected from the primal, freezing chaos of the natural world outside. But the ocean is patient, and in the autumn of 1854, the sea was waiting to shatter that illusion forever. On the crisp, grey morning of September 20th, 1854, the SS Arctic slipped her moorings at the Liverpool landing stage and began her journey west toward New York, toward the abyss. On board were 408 souls, 233 passengers, and 175 crew members. The passenger manifest read like a roster of the elite. Traveling in the lavish saloon class was the family of Edward Collins himself, the owner of the shipping line. His wife Mary and two of his children, Henry and Mary, rested comfortably in their grand cabins. Not far from them was the family of James Brown, the powerful bank president who financed the very ship they sailed upon. At the helm stood Captain James Luce, a seasoned, respected mariner who knew the unpredictable moods of the Atlantic intimately. But on this voyage, his heart was heavy with a rare personal joy. He had brought his 11-year-old son, Willie, with him. Willie had suffered from a mysterious, debilitating illness his entire life, and the captain and his wife had hoped the bracing sea air of Europe might cure the boy. Now father and son were making the return journey together. Willie spent his days resting in the cabin or playing quietly with the children of the elite. The voyage began peacefully, a routine crossing filled with fine food, laughter, and the steady, reassuring heartbeat of the great steam engines deep in the belly of the ship. But as the days passed and the Arctic steamed further from the safety of land, the air began to change. As the paddle steamer pushed deeper into the mid-North Atlantic, a biting, unnatural cold settled over the deck. The passengers who had spent the first few days strolling the upper promenades in the autumn sun slowly retreated into the warmth of the grand saloons. The sky turned the color of bruised iron, and the sea grew heavy and dark. The Arctic was approaching the Grand Banks off the coast of Newfoundland, a notorious graveyard of ships where the warm Gulf Stream violently collides with the freezing Labrador Current. By September 27th, the world outside the ship had vanished. A thick, suffocating fog rolled across the water, swallowing the Arctic entirely. It was a blinding, absolute whiteout, a sensory deprivation chamber, where the only sound was the deep, rhythmic churning of the wooden paddles. Captain Luce stood on the bridge, his eyes straining against the impenetrable wall of mist. His instincts as a sailor screamed at him to pull the telegraph and slow the engines, to creep through this dangerous, heavily trafficked fishing ground with caution. But the phantom politicians in Washington whispered in his ear. The mandate was clear: full speed. And so the Arctic plowed blindly forward at 13 knots, tearing through the white void like a massive, blind beast. Unbeknownst to Captain Luce, out there in the freezing fog, a tiny, iron-hulled French fishing steamer named the Vesta was slipping through the very same waters. Its sharp metal bow pointed directly at them, completely hidden in the silence, waiting for the exact moment when it would be too late to turn away. It was noon. The air over the Grand Banks was heavy, damp and freezing. The passengers in the grand saloons were finishing their midday meals, completely insulated from the blind, white world outside. Up on the freezing deck, the lookouts strained their eyes against the impenetrable fog. It was a sensory void, a place where up and down, left and right seemed to lose all meaning. There was only the bone-chilling mist, the stinging spray of the sea, and the relentless, rhythmic thud, thud, thud of the massive wooden paddle wheels driving the ship blindly forward. Suddenly, the white mist began to darken. A shadow, dense and unnatural, began to materialize directly ahead. It did not emerge slowly, it simply appeared, like a ghost stepping through a solid wall. It was the Vesta, sailing under full canvas and full steam, cutting through the water at 10 knots. The sharp, iron-hulled bow of the French steamer was pointed directly at the wooden heart of the Arctic. The lookout on the bow felt the blood drain from his face. He gripped the freezing rail and screamed into the white void, "Stop steamer ahead!" The words hung in the mist for a fraction of a second before the reality of the nightmare took hold. The shadow was no longer a shadow. It was black iron, white sails, and rushing water, and it was closing the distance with terrifying speed. There was no time to think, no time to calculate, only time to react as the two leviathans rushed to a catastrophic embrace. High on the bridge of the Arctic, the officer on watch heard the scream. Through the swirling fog, he saw the terrifying silhouette of the Vesta bearing down upon them. He had only a matter of seconds to make a decision that would seal the fate of hundreds of souls. The standard law of the sea dictated that ships should pass each other on the right, but the Vesta was too close and the Arctic was too massive, carrying too much momentum. Turning to the left, to the port side, was the fastest way out of the immediate danger, but it required the phantom ship in the fog to perfectly mirror the maneuver. The officer shouted the command, hard to starboard, a tiller command which, in the inverse logic of the sea, meant forcing the massive ship to veer hard to port. Deep in the engine room, the telegraph bells screamed. The engineers, startled by the sudden alarm, frantically worked to stop the engines. The starboard paddle wheels slowed, and the great wooden ship began to sluggishly drag herself to the left, trying to slide out of the path of the incoming iron blade. But out in the fog, panic had seized the crew of the Vesta. Falling back on standard procedure rather than reading the Arctic's desperate maneuver, the French captain ordered his ship to turn to the right. It was a fatal miscalculation. By turning to the right, the Vesta aimed her iron bow directly into the path of the turning Arctic. The ships were now locked in a deadly, unavoidable dance. The officer on the Arctic screamed for the engines to go full astern, to reverse, but the great wooden Titan was too heavy, and time had simply run out. Captain James Luce stepped out onto the deck by the starboard paddle box just in time to witness the nightmare unfold. He watched, paralyzed, as the sharp iron-reinforced bow of the Vesta tore violently into the wooden starboard bow of his ship. The sound was deafening, a horrific, shrieking crash of splintering oak, tearing metal, and snapping cables. The long wooden bowsprit of the French steamer stabbed straight through the hull of the Arctic, plunging deep into the crew quarters and instantly impaling a sailor where he stood. The impact was brutally unequal. The Vesta, being a fraction of the size of the Arctic, was violently twisted and shredded by the sheer momentum of the American Titan. The French ship's foremast collapsed instantly, yanked down by the tangled rigging. Its iron bow was crushed, crumpled, and rented open, but the Arctic simply kept steaming forward, trampling the smaller ship beneath her massive hull. The Vesta scraped violently along the side of the Arctic, dislocating thick wooden hull plates and smashing into the forward part of the massive paddle box, ripping the heavy wooden bumper clean off. And yet, despite the horrifying violence occurring just feet away, the passengers dining in the grand saloons below barely noticed a thing. To them, the catastrophic impact felt like nothing more than a bump, a slight shiver, a momentary quiver that rattled the silver on the tables. The massive wooden hull of the Arctic had absorbed the shock so completely that no one in the warm, lavish cabins had any idea that death had just knocked on the door. As the Arctic coasted forward, her forward momentum barely checked by the collision, a chilling silence rushed back in to fill the void left by the crash. The Vesta scraped past the stern and vanished back into the suffocating white fog, drifting away like a broken toy. Captain Luce leaned frantically over the starboard rail, his eyes scanning the splintered wood of his own ship. He let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. From his vantage point, the damage appeared severe, but mostly above the waterline. It looked as though the Arctic had survived the blow. He ordered a handful of crewmen below decks to inspect the hull and ensure she was still watertight. The ship was stable, the engines were intact, and the panic began to subside. But out in the fog behind them, a chorus of horrifying screams began to echo over the black water. On board the Vesta, the scene was one of absolute bloody carnage. The forward end of the ship had been completely obliterated. Men had been crushed and torn apart in the twisted iron, and the freezing sea was pouring directly into her exposed cargo hold. Captain Luce could not see the French ship, but he could hear the desperate, ragged cries of the fishermen as their vessel began to drop rapidly by the bow. He heard the panic, he heard the splashing of men plunging into the freezing ocean. Believing his own massive ship was safe, Captain Luce made a fateful decision. He ordered the Arctic's engines re-engaged. He ordered his crew to slowly turn the great ship around, heading back into the blinding fog to save the men of the dying Vesta, completely unaware that the true fatal wound was hidden deep beneath his own feet. The massive wooden paddle wheels of the Arctic churned the freezing Atlantic into a violently white foam as Captain Luce ordered the great Leviathan to turn slowly to starboard. He was doubling back into the blinding, impenetrable white mist, determined to rescue the desperate souls aboard the dying French steamer. Through the suffocating fog, the ragged cries of the fishermen echoed over the water like ghosts trapped in purgatory. To Luce, the Vesta was rapidly sinking. He could see her forward deck entirely submerged, her exposed cargo hold drinking in the freezing ocean. He immediately ordered his crew to clear the lifeboats, to lower them quickly so they could row over and pull the drowning men from the black water. Chief Officer Gawley was the first to swing his wooden boat out over the precipice, lowering it down into the dark, rolling swells. Second Officer Ballum struggled with his own boat's ropes, his fingers numbed by the freezing dampness that clung to every surface of the ship. As Gawley's men rowed away into the mist, slipping entirely out of sight, the Arctic began to slowly orbit the crippled Vesta like a massive wooden predator circling its prey. But Captain Luce was not a predator. He was a savior, or at least that is what he fiercely believed in those fragile, fleeting moments. He shouted orders through his brass-speaking trumpet, but his voice was swallowed by the heavy, dead air. He had no way of knowing that the lifeboat carrying Chief Officer Gawley and the brave men rowing it would row straight into the freezing fog and never be seen by human eyes again. On the decks of the Arctic, a bizarre and incredibly eerie tranquility had taken hold. The initial fleeting shock of the collision had entirely dissolved, replaced by a morbid, whispering curiosity. The passengers, dressed in heavy wool coats and fine imported furs, began to pour out from the warmth of the grand saloons. They gathered tightly at the starboard railing, pressing against one another, their breath rising in pale, nervous plumes against the freezing autumn air. Hundreds of men, women, and children crowded the edge of the ship, children holding tightly to their mothers' hands as they peered into the mist to catch a glimpse of the sinking Vesta. They watched the chaos and death unfolding on the French vessel with a sense of total, comfortable detachment. They were aboard the Arctic, the unsinkable Titan, the grandest palace on the ocean. They felt absolutely no fear for their own lives, only a distant pity for the wretched souls on the broken iron ship. The weight of so many bodies pressing against the starboard rail was so immense that the colossal steamer actually began to list, leaning ever so slightly to the right. It was a small tilt, a gentle shift in gravity easily ignored by the wealthy onlookers, but it was the first subtle betrayal of the ship's balance. Below them, hidden beneath the dark, freezing waves, the ocean was already inside, pouring into the splintered wounds of the hull, quietly filling the empty spaces in the dark.
But on deck, the passengers merely conversed in hushed tones, completely unaware that they were standing on a floating tomb. As the Arctic continued her slow, cautious orbit around the settling Vesta, Captain Luce stood on the open bridge, his senses sharp, completely attuned to the mechanical breathing of his ship. He knew the Arctic like he knew his own pulse. He knew the deep hum of her massive iron engines, the agonizing groan of her oak timbers in the swells, and the exact rhythmic splashing of her paddle wheels. And as he listened intently into the fog, a creeping, icy dread began to coil deep in his stomach. The sound was wrong. It was incredibly subtle, so faint that no passenger or ordinary sailor could ever have noticed it. But to the captain it was deafening. The rhythmic slapping of the wooden paddles against the water was growing heavier, deeper, and much more labored. The enormous wooden wheels were struggling, biting much deeper into the heavy ocean with every single rotation. The massive ship was losing her buoyancy. She was riding lower in the water. The realization struck him with the paralyzing force of a physical blow. The Arctic was sinking. He immediately leaned over the wooden rail and shouted down to Second Officer Ballum, who was still struggling to lower the second lifeboat into the sea. He ordered Ballum to abort the launch, to pull the boat back aboard immediately. The rescue mission was over. It was time to inspect their own bleeding hull. The captain's voice, usually calm and composed, cracked with a desperate, unfamiliar urgency that sent a sudden ripple of unease through the nearby passengers. The ocean was no longer something to be watched from a safe distance. It was coming for them. Second Officer Ballum quickly secured the heavy lifeboat and grabbed a passing fireman, a man who had just come up from the sweltering, coal-choked boiler rooms for his midday break. Together, they climbed cautiously over the starboard railing, dangling precariously above the freezing, violently churning water near the massive wooden paddle box. They peered down into the misty gloom, searching for the exact point of impact, and what they saw froze the very blood in their veins. Hanging directly from the mangled, splintered wood of the Arctic's hull was a massive, jagged chunk of the Vesta's iron bow. It had snapped off completely during the violent twisting of the collision and remained deeply embedded in the wooden ship like a rusty, broken spear. And around this grotesque iron splinter were three massive, gaping holes torn right through the thick oak planks. Two of these fatal wounds were entirely submerged below the waterline. The dark, freezing Atlantic was rushing into the belly of the Arctic in absolute torrents, a relentless, deafening waterfall of black water flooding the lower decks. The sheer volume of the breach was catastrophic. Ballum pulled himself back over the rail, his face as pale as a ghost, and delivered the horrifying news to Captain Luce. The Vesta was not the only ship doomed to the abyss that cold afternoon. The unshakable pride of the Collins Line, the great wooden Leviathan, was bleeding out into the sea, and because she was an older wooden vessel, her watertight bulkheads, the very things that could have saved her, did not exist. The freezing water was free to flow wherever it pleased, and it was rising fast. The terrifying reality of the fatal wound sent a shockwave through the crew. Captain Luce was a man of the sea, accustomed to the violent tempests of the open ocean, but this was a quiet, insidious death. The water was not crashing over the bow, it was silently filling them up from the inside out. With the terrifying knowledge that the iron shards of the Vesta had ripped open the hull below the waterline, Luce immediately barked 3 desperate orders in rapid succession.
First, he ordered the immediate activation of all the ship's massive steam bilge pumps. Second, he commanded the crew to rush below decks and plug the gaping holes from the inside, using whatever cargo, mattresses, and blankets they could find. And third, he ordered sailors to fashion a massive canvas sail to be lowered over the side of the ship, hoping the tremendous pressure of the ocean would suck the heavy cloth into the breaches and seal them from the outside. Within seconds, the deck began to vibrate violently. The mighty steam pumps roared to life, violently shaking the wooden planks underfoot as they began to siphon thousands of black water from the belly of the ship. The water was blasted up and over the sides of the Arctic, spraying the decks with a freezing mist. For a brief, fleeting moment, the deafening roar of the machinery gave the terrified crew a sense of false hope. The unyielding power of American steam would surely hold the primitive ocean at bay.
But deep below the lavish grand saloons, in the freezing, suffocating darkness of the lower decks, that hope was violently ripped away. A squad of desperate crewmen plunged down the narrow wooden stairwells, hauling heavy mattresses, expensive cargo, and thick wool blankets. But as they reached the lower cargo holds, they were met with a scene from a nightmare. The ocean was not merely leaking into the ship, it was blasting through the splintered oak with the deafening force of a cannon. The freezing, pitch-black water slammed into the men, knocking them off their feet and throwing them back into the dark. The water pressure at that depth was absolute, a crushing physical weight that no human hands could fight against. They frantically tried to shove the heavy, soaked mattresses into the jagged wounds, but the ocean simply spat them back out, blasting the men with freezing spray and tearing the fabric from their numb, bleeding hands. The water was rising too fast. It was already past their knees, freezing their legs and pulling at their clothes in the suffocating darkness. The men realized with absolute horrifying certainty that the holes were simply too large and too deep beneath the waterline to ever be plugged from the inside. The ocean had already claimed the lower half of the mighty Arctic, and it was greedily reaching for the rest. Defeated, freezing, and terrified, the crewmen scrambled back up the wooden ladders, abandoning the lower decks to the rising black abyss.
With the internal defenses completely shattered, the captain's only remaining hope of stopping the catastrophic flooding rested on the canvas shroud. Up on the freezing, mist-slicked deck, a group of sailors frantically unrolled a massive, heavy canvas sail. They tied thick ropes to its corners and carefully lowered it over the starboard side of the ship, directly over the mangled paddle box and the site of the collision. The theory was sound. Sailors had used this desperate tactic for centuries. The sheer pressure of the ocean rushing into the hull would pull the heavy canvas tight against the wood, sealing the wounds like a giant bandage. But the Arctic was not just wounded, she was impaled. As the men lowered the heavy canvas into the churning, freezing water, it wrapped around the hull, but it instantly caught on the jagged, rusty iron shards of the Vesta's bow that were still violently lodged in the wood. The heavy ocean swells pushed and pulled against the canvas, grinding it against the razor-sharp metal. In seconds, the thick, heavy sail was slashed to ribbons. It tore apart in the black water, rendered completely useless, just floating away into the fog like a shredded ghost. Captain Luce stood on the deck, watching the final desperate attempt to patch his bleeding ship fail completely. He looked around at the faces of his terrified crew, and the dawning realization settled over him like a freezing shroud. The Arctic, the unsinkable titan of the Collins line, could not be saved. She was going to sink to the bottom of the North Atlantic, and like almost every single ship of her era, she did not carry nearly enough lifeboats for everyone on board.
With all defenses broken, Captain Luce had only one terrifying option left. Newfoundland was approximately 4 hours away. A desolate, freezing coastline, but it was land. He had to turn his dying, bleeding ship directly toward the coast and make a mad, desperate dash for survival, praying the engines would hold out long enough to run the Arctic aground before the water reached the boiler rooms. He shouted the order to the engine room, "Full steam ahead, due west." The great wooden beast shuddered as the massive paddle wheels bit deeply into the water once again. In order to save the hundreds of souls on board, Luce had to make a horrific sacrifice. He had to abandon the Vesta, and he had to abandon his loyal friend, Chief Officer Gourlay, who had rowed away in the lifeboat to help the French fishermen. He ordered flags raised and the ship's horn blown, signaling for Gourlay to return immediately, but the tiny wooden boat had vanished entirely into the thick, blinding fog. Gourlay and his men were never seen again. But as the Arctic began her desperate sprint for land, the ocean demanded another sacrifice. Unbeknownst to Captain Luce, a single lifeboat from the Vesta had managed to launch in the chaos. 12 terrified French fishermen had rowed frantically toward the massive American ship, seeking salvation. But as the Arctic suddenly surged forward at full speed, the tiny lifeboat was pulled directly into the colossal churning blades of the starboard paddle wheel. The heavy wooden blades smashed down upon the small boat, instantly chewing it to splinters and dragging the men deep underwater. Only one heavily battered fisherman managed to survive the horrific meat grinder, pulled aboard by a horrified sailor. It was the first violent, bloody tragedy of the afternoon, a grim foreshadowing of the sheer animalistic horror that was about to unfold. As the mighty Arctic surged westward through the blinding, impenetrable fog, the terrifying reality of their situation began to settle over the freezing deck like a suffocating blanket. Captain Luce had made the agonizing split-second decision to run for the desolate, rocky coast of Newfoundland, abandoning the crippled Vesta to the abyss and leaving his loyal friend, Chief Officer Gourlay, lost forever in the white void. It was a desperate, violent gamble, a race against the freezing ocean that was pouring relentlessly into the ship's lower decks. But even as the massive wooden paddle wheels chewed through the heavy swells of the Atlantic, efforts continued to try and save the bleeding Titan from her fate. The ship's carpenter, a hardened, quiet man who knew every timber and nail of the vessel, fashioned a precarious, swinging wooden scaffold over the starboard side. Hanging dangerously above the churning black water, he attempted to manually plug the gaping, splintered wounds left by the French steamer's iron bow, but it was like trying to stop a bleeding artery with his bare hands. The sheer, crushing force of the ocean rushing past the hull at 13 knots ripped his heavy tools away into the dark, and the freezing, stinging spray blinded his eyes. The splintered oak was simply too mangled, the rusted iron shards too deeply embedded in the wood. After exhausting every ounce of his strength, he eventually climbed back over the railing, his heavy clothes soaked in freezing seawater, and shook his head in defeat. The wounds were mortal. The Arctic was entirely at the mercy of the pumps. With the hull hopelessly and permanently breached, Captain Luce realized that if he could not stop the black water from coming in, he had to physically lift the terrifying wound out of the sea. He shouted desperate orders through the thick mist to shift the immense, crushing weight of the ship away from the flooding starboard bow. The crew, driven by the frantic, sickening adrenaline of survival, scrambled to the forward deck. They uncoupled the massive, heavy iron anchors from their housings and, with bruised, freezing hands, dragged them across the wooden planks, heaving them over the port side. They let the massive iron chains run completely loose, plunging into the deep, dragging the left side of the ship down toward the water. Next, the officers began to corral the terrified passengers. Hundreds of men, women, and children were ushered like frightened sheep away from the starboard side, pushing them tightly together on the aft port quarter of the ship. It was a surreal, deeply unsettling migration. The elite, the wealthy, and the working crew shivering tightly together in the damp, freezing fog. And incredibly, this desperate, primitive tactic seemed to work. With hundreds of tons of human and iron weight violently shifted to the left and to the rear, the massive wooden ship groaned against the waves and slowly began to tilt. The bleeding starboard bow was lifted agonizingly out of the deepest part of the swells, easing the torrential, deafening influx of the ocean. For a brief, intoxicating moment, a wave of relief washed over the freezing deck. They believed they had bought themselves time. But the ocean is a merciless and infinitely patient adversary, and the grand, luxurious Arctic harbored a fatal, invisible design flaw beneath her polished mahogany floors. While newer, modern iron ships were constructed with watertight bulkheads, thick, heavy walls designed to seal off flooding compartments and keep a vessel buoyant, this great wooden palace had none. The lower decks of the Arctic were essentially a vast, open, hollow cavern. So when Captain Luce brilliantly shifted the weight of the ship to the stern to lift the bleeding bow out of the waves, the thousands of gallons of black, freezing seawater already trapped inside the ship simply followed gravity. The massive interior flood shifted, rushing violently backward into the empty, darkened spaces of the lower aft decks. It sloshed and roared through the cargo holds in the pitch black, drowning everything in its path. The ship was not saved. The rotting cancer had simply moved deeper into her body. As the Arctic plowed blindly forward into the fog, the massive extra drag of the dead water deep in her belly made her terrifyingly sluggish. The great paddle wheels were forced to work twice as hard to push the dying, heavy behemoth through the waves. The 4 massive steam bilge pumps screamed and vibrated under the floorboards, blasting seawater over the sides in a continuous, deafening waterfall. But it was no longer enough to keep the abyss at bay. The internal waterline was rising, slowly, silently, and with absolute, terrifying inevitability. The freezing ocean was creeping up the lower bulkheads in the dark, inching closer and closer to the beating, fiery heart of the ship, the boiler rooms. With the mechanical steam pumps slowly losing their bitter battle against the abyss, the desperate call was made for manual labor. The Arctic was equipped with several heavy, cast-iron hand pumps situated on the upper decks. The crew could not operate them all alone, so the male passengers, wealthy bankers, merchants, and refined gentlemen who had never known a day of physical labor in their lives, threw off their heavy wool coats and stepped forward into the mist. They formed desperate, exhausted lines in the freezing fog, taking short, frantic shifts at the heavy wooden handles. Up and down, the repetitive, agonizing motion tearing at their unused muscles. They worked until their lungs burned like fire in the freezing air, until they collapsed from absolute exhaustion on the wet, slippery deck, and then another terrified man would immediately take their place. As the cold hours bled by, the heavy wooden handles of the pumps became slick and sticky in the pale light, not with freezing seawater, but with the bright red blood from their raw, blistered and torn hands. It was a gruesome, desperate fight for life on the surface, and deep below them, in the sweltering, terrifying darkness of the engine room, the stokers and engineers were living a true, suffocating nightmare.
The black, freezing water was slowly rising up their legs, threatening to reach the roaring, white-hot furnaces. If the freezing ocean touched the superheated iron boilers, the resulting explosion would tear the wooden ship to atoms in a fraction of a second. They desperately wanted to flee, to run for the fresh air of the upper decks, but they were persuaded to stay down in the dark, to keep shoveling coal into the roaring fires, because they knew with terrifying certainty that the moment
Deep in the sweltering, suffocating bowels of the Arctic, the terrifying battle against the ocean finally reached its violent, inevitable conclusion. The stokers, their faces black with coal dust and slick with sweat, had shoveled frantically for hours, desperate to feed the roaring, white-hot furnaces. But the freezing black water was relentless. It had crept up their ankles, then their knees, pulling at their heavy, soaked clothes with a freezing, magnetic grip. And then the absolute worst fear of any steamship engineer came to pass. The rising ocean finally crested the heavy iron lips of the grates and poured directly into the roaring fires. The reaction was instantaneous and violently catastrophic. The freezing Atlantic met the superheated iron and white-hot coals with a deafening, monstrous hiss that shook the very foundations of the ship. A massive, blinding cloud of scalding steam violently erupted from the furnaces, blowing back into the cramped, pitch-black engine room. The entire ship shuddered violently, a massive, agonizing convulsion that vibrated all the way up to the uppermost decks. To those standing shivering in the fog above, it felt as though a massive bomb had detonated deep within the belly of the Leviathan. Down below, the surviving stokers and engineers dropped their heavy iron shovels and scrambled blindly for the narrow wooden ladders, fleeing the rising, boiling black water. The roaring, fiery heart of the grand Arctic had been drowned. The massive iron engines groaned, hissed, and slowly, terrifyingly, ground to a permanent dead halt. With the massive engines dead, the Arctic was instantly transformed from a surging, powerful leviathan into a drifting, rotting corpse. The rhythmic, thudding heartbeat of the great wooden paddle wheels simply stopped. The heavy blades drifted to a halt, leaving the ship suspended in a terrifying, absolute silence, save for the howling of the wind and the lapping of the freezing waves against the splintered hull. They were no longer racing toward the safety of the Newfoundland coast. They were simply waiting to die in the middle of the blinding white void. But the death of the engines brought a secondary, far more immediate horror. The 4 massive steam bilge pumps, the only things keeping the terrifying influx of the ocean at bay, suddenly gurgled, sputtered, and died. The heavy vibration beneath the floorboards ceased entirely. The mechanical waterfall of freezing spray over the side of the ship slowed to a miserable trickle and then stopped altogether. The only defense left against the crushing weight of the North Atlantic were the heavy iron hand pumps on the upper deck and the exhausted, terrified men whose blistered hands were already slick with their own blood. But without the massive power of the steam pumps, it was a totally futile effort. The ocean was now free to pour into the hollow wooden cavern of the lower decks with absolutely no resistance. The ship began to settle noticeably deeper into the swells, her death no longer a distant possibility, but an imminent, rapidly approaching reality. Up on the freezing, mist-slicked deck, Captain Luce felt the final shudder of the dying engines beneath his boots. He knew the Arctic was lost. The grand floating palace, the pride of the American nation, was going to sink to the black, freezing bottom of the ocean within the hour. He had to organize the evacuation immediately.
But like almost every single ship of this era, they carried only 6 lifeboats, nowhere near enough for the 408 terrified souls trapped aboard. Luce knew that when the wealthy passengers truly realized the brutal mathematics of their doom, panic would consume the ship like a wildfire. To curb the inevitable disorder, he immediately ordered the ship's quartermasters to arm themselves. The loyal officers drew heavy iron revolvers and grabbed long-handled boarding axes from the emergency lockers, the cold mist clinging to the sharpened steel. They were ordered to form a violent, impenetrable perimeter around the remaining lifeboats, standing between the terrifying freezing abyss and the desperate crowds. Luce's plan was methodical and honorable. He wanted to lower all the lifeboats simultaneously, to load them carefully with the women, the children, and the provisions first, and then keep the small flotilla together in the fog so they could row toward the coast as a single unified group. But Captain Luce was projecting his own deep sense of honor onto a crew that was rapidly losing its humanity. The creeping, freezing dread of the ocean was already beginning to strip away the thin veneer of civilization.
The first lifeboat to be readied was the aft starboard boat, the very same boat that Second Officer Barlam had struggled with earlier that afternoon. It was carefully lowered to the level of the main deck, and the quartermasters stood by with heavy axes raised as the weeping, terrified women and children were ushered aboard. The boat was stocked with heavy wooden casks of fresh water and salted provisions. Captain Luce placed the ship's butcher, a man he believed to be strong and reliable, in direct command of the small wooden vessel. The orders were incredibly clear. Lower the boat slowly to the waterline, detach the heavy ropes, and wait closely by the side of the sinking ship until the rest of the lifeboats were safely loaded and in the water. The heavy boat, packed tightly with shivering families, was lowered into the rolling black swells. But the moment the wooden hull touched the freezing ocean, a quiet, terrifying mutiny took place. The butcher and the few armed sailors in the boat did not wait. They looked up at the towering, dying bulk of the Arctic, looked at the terrified faces of the women shivering in the boat with them, and they drew their knives. In absolute cowardly silence, they sliced through the thick mooring ropes. They pushed hard against the splintered hull of the ship, grabbed the heavy wooden oars, and rowed frantically away, slipping completely into the blinding, freezing fog, abandoning their captain, abandoning their duty, and abandoning hundreds of doomed souls. This lifeboat and every single person aboard it was never seen by human eyes again.
The silent, cowardly departure of the butcher's lifeboat was not just a singular act of treason, it was a virulent infection. As the small wooden boat vanished entirely into the suffocating white fog, a terrifying realization washed over the remaining crew members standing on the freezing, mist-slicked deck. The unbreakable laws of the sea, the sacred unwritten duty to protect the passengers until the very end, had just been shattered with absolutely no consequence. Captain Luce, standing near the towering funnel of the sloping deck, watched the thick fog swallow the deserters, and he knew in that gut-wrenching moment that his authority was rapidly bleeding away into the cold air. The crew, the firemen, the stokers, the able seamen who were supposed to be the mechanical and moral backbone of the mighty Arctic were becoming increasingly self-centered, driven completely mad by the terrifying, creeping proximity of the freezing abyss. Their eyes, wide with the primal, shivering terror of the rising ocean, no longer looked to the captain for guidance. They looked only at the few remaining lifeboats hanging precariously over the black water. Luce found himself in a horrifying, completely unprecedented position for a mariner of his stature. He could no longer trust the men wearing the proud uniform of the Collins line. He was forced to turn his back on his own sailors and instead rely on the male passengers, the wealthy bankers, the merchants, the diplomats and the lawyers, men who had never tied a nautical knot in their privileged lives. He desperately ordered these gentlemen to form a protective human wall around the aft port lifeboat, to stand against the rogue crewmen whose minds had been utterly broken by fear. The gentlemen, shivering violently in their heavy, saturated wool coats, gripped their makeshift weapons, preparing to defend the innocent against the very men hired to protect them.
Under the tense, violently charged atmosphere, the male passengers managed to begin loading the aft port lifeboat. Dozens of terrified women and weeping children were carefully lowered over the splintered railing and into the swinging wooden hull, holding tightly to one another as the freezing sea churned hungrily directly below them. The children cried out in the biting cold, their small faces pale and drawn in the heavy mist. For a fleeting moment, it seemed that human civilization might hold out just a little longer against the darkness, but the sight of the women safely seated aboard the only viable means of escape proved to be far too much for the terrified rogue crewmen. The breaking point was suddenly reached. With a collective, animalistic shout, a mob of firemen and sailors violently rushed the lifeboat. The gentlemen passengers swung heavy boarding axes and thick wooden mallets, desperately trying to beat back the cowards in a blur of swigging steel and heavy coats. The deck devolved into a chaotic, bloody brawl in the thick mist, men fighting men for the simple right to live. But the sheer, frantic rush of the desperate crewmen destabilized the delicate boarding process. In the terrifying crush of heavy bodies, the forward tackle, the thick ropes and pulleys suspending the front of the lifeboat high above the water, suddenly snapped under the violent strain. The sound was like a heavy gunshot echoing through the fog. The heavy wooden boat immediately swung violently downward, hanging completely vertical from the remaining rear ropes. A horrific, deafening chorus of screams pierced the freezing air as every single woman and child inside the boat was violently dumped directly into the churning black ocean. They plunged into the freezing depths, dragged down instantly by the heavy, suffocating weight of their saturated winter dresses and heavy coats. Within seconds, the sea swallowed them entirely, leaving only the splintered, empty lifeboat swinging like a morbid pendulum against the dying ship. Not a single woman or child from that boat survived the plunge.
The slaughter of the innocents sent a paralyzing shock of pure, unadulterated horror through the remaining passengers. The desperate screams of the women and children were rapidly replaced by the terrifying absolute silence of the dying Arctic. Without the massive steam pumps to fight back the ocean, the black water was now entirely free to fill the empty cavern of the lower decks without any resistance whatsoever. The freezing sea gurgled and hissed as it swallowed the grand, lavish saloons below, rising silently over the plush velvet chairs, the polished mahogany tables, and the ornate crystal chandeliers, dragging the opulent floating palace deeper and deeper into the suffocating abyss. The water inside the ship moved like a living entity, hunting through the dark corridors, claiming every inch of empty space. But while the passengers stood in frozen, traumatized shock, staring down at the empty, swinging lifeboat, Second Officer Balaam was quietly enacting his own desperate, cowardly plan for survival. Balaam, the man who had pretended to be so fiercely loyal to the captain just hours before, had quietly prepared another lifeboat on the opposite side of the ship. He meticulously readied the heavy falls and ropes, ensuring that the terrifying mechanical failure of the port boat would not be repeated. His boat was carefully lowered to the freezing black swells, bobbing violently against the massive splintered paddle box. But Balaam did not attempt to fill his boat with the weeping families still trapped on the sloping, dying deck. Instead, the wooden boat was almost entirely comprised of his fellow crewmen, men who had abandoned their posts and their honor to secure their own salvation. The boat was less than half full, carrying mostly strong, able-bodied sailors, leaving plenty of empty seats that could have meant the difference between life and death for the desperate souls watching helplessly from above.
Captain Luce, his face pale, bruised, and strained with unimaginable exhaustion, leaned heavily over the splintered wooden railing of the sinking deck. He looked down through the freezing mist and saw Second Officer Balaam sitting safely in the half-empty lifeboat, surrounded by silent, guilty crewmen. Luce raised his dented brass speaking trumpet to his cracked lips and screamed his orders down to the boat, his voice echoing over the rolling waves. He commanded Balaam to stand by, to keep the lifeboat tethered closely to the sinking Arctic, and to wait in the freezing swells to pick up the people who would inevitably be thrown into the water when the great Titan finally went under. The order was sound, logical, and deeply human. It was the final, desperate plea of a broken captain trying to save even a fraction of his terrified passengers from the freezing black water. But the creeping terror of the ocean had entirely stripped away Balaam's humanity. He looked up at the towering, dying ship, its massive wooden hull groaning and shrieking in pure agony as the sea pulled it down, and then he simply looked away, his eyes cold and empty. In absolute defiant silence, Balaam unhooked the heavy ropes from the paddle box. He ordered his men to take up the heavy wooden oars, and they began to row. They rowed away from the captain who had trusted them. They rowed away from the weeping passengers who were begging for their lives over the splintered railing, and they rowed away into the blinding white fog toward the distant coast of Newfoundland. The second officer had chosen his own survival over his sacred duty, abandoning the sinking Arctic and ensuring that the dark, freezing waters of the North Atlantic would become a massive, unmarked grave for the innocent souls left behind. As Second Officer Balaam's half-empty lifeboat faded into the blinding, suffocating white fog, a profound and heavy despair settled over the freezing, sloping deck of the dying Arctic. The massive wooden Leviathan was sinking lower by the stern with every passing minute, the freezing black water now freely claiming the opulent grand saloons and the lavish dining halls below. And with the water rising, the fragile bonds of human decency were completely dissolving in the cold air. Another of the heavy wooden lifeboats was hastily lowered into the churning swells, packed tightly with desperate, terrified men who had violently pushed their way past the shivering families. It was in this chaotic, desperate scramble that the French diplomat, the Duke of Gramont, made a frantic, fateful decision. Abandoning his aristocratic composure, he leapt wildly over the splintered wooden railing, plunging through the freezing mist and crashing hard into the wooden floor of the departing lifeboat. He survived, but his desperate, ungentlemanly escape would become a dark, heavily scrutinized controversy that would shadow him for the rest of his life. As this boat, too, pushed away from the groaning, dying ship and rode into the abyss, the terrified crowds on the deck realized with sickening clarity that the avenues of escape were rapidly vanishing. Captain Luce, his face etched with utter exhaustion and disbelief, turned his attention to the final 2 lifeboats, small, fragile wooden shells that hung precariously near the stern. They were the very last hope for the hundreds of weeping souls still trapped on the floating tomb. But the freezing, blinding fog hid yet another act of absolute cowardly betrayal.
While Captain Luce and the remaining loyal officers were desperately trying to maintain order on the chaotic port side of the ship, a quiet, insidious mutiny was taking place in the shadows of the starboard deck. The ship's chief engineer, the very man responsible for the mechanical heart of the great vessel, had completely surrendered to the creeping terror of the ocean. Gathering a small group of his closest friends in rogue firemen, he approached one of the final 2 lifeboats, but he did not intend to save the weeping women or the freezing children. Instead, the chief engineer meticulously loaded the small wooden boat with heavy wooden crates of fresh provisions, thick woolen blankets, boxes of expensive cigars, and the ship's heavy iron pistols. In absolute cowardly silence, they lowered the boat into the freezing black swells, unhooked the heavy ropes, and quietly snuck away into the suffocating mist. As they rowed their well-stocked, half-empty boat away from the dying ship, they passed desperate, freezing passengers who had already fallen into the churning water. The drowning men screamed for help, reaching their blue, freezing hands out toward the wooden oars, but the chief engineer ordered his men to keep rowing, refusing to pull a single soul from the freezing sea, despite having plenty of empty seats. It was a breathtaking display of cruelty, a cold, mechanical preservation of self that left the innocent to be swallowed by the dark. When Captain Luce finally made his way back across the sloping, slippery wooden deck and discovered the empty davits where the chief engineer's boat had hung, a paralyzing, sickening realization washed over him. It was a brutal, physical gut punch that brought the seasoned mariner to his absolute breaking point. 5 of the ship's 6 lifeboats were now completely gone, stolen away into the blinding, freezing fog by the very men hired to protect the ship. And the most horrifying, terrifying realization of all was the cold mathematics of their doom. In all the chaos, the mutinies, and the violent brawls, not a single woman or child had been safely taken away from the dying ship. The elite families of the Collins line, the wife and children of Edward Collins himself, the family of James Brown, the wealthy banker, and the family of George Allen were all still standing on the freezing, tilted deck, clutching each other as the ocean roared below them. And Captain Luce's own 11-year-old son, Willie, who had been resting in his cabin, was now trapped in this nightmare. Almost all of the ship's officers, engineers, and able sailors had completely abandoned their posts, leaving a broken captain, a handful of loyal men, and hundreds of doomed, terrified passengers to face the freezing abyss alone. With only one small lifeboat left and the Arctic groaning in the final agonizing throes of her life, the captain knew there was no longer a chance for a mass rescue. They had to prepare for the end. With the massive wooden ship now lurching and heaving terrifyingly as the stern dropped deeper into the freezing Atlantic, the remaining souls aboard the Arctic fractured into 3 distinct, heartbreaking groups. The first group remained fiercely loyal to Captain Luce and 4th Officer Francis Dorian, a brave man who refused to abandon his post. Together, they drew their heavy axes and began a desperate, frantic effort to construct a massive wooden raft, tearing the heavy wooden doors off their iron hinges, chopping down the massive wooden spars from the masts, and dragging every piece of buoyant debris to the lowest point of the sloping deck. The second group was comprised of the wealthy women, the children, and the elite families. Realizing with absolute chilling certainty that there was no escape, they accepted their grim fate with a haunting, quiet dignity. They gathered closely together on the freezing wooden planks, wrapping their arms around their shivering children, and began to quietly pray into the thick white mist, appealing to God for salvation in the dark water. But the third group, a violent mob of rogue crewmen and terrified, broken men, appealed entirely to the devil. Driven completely mad by the sheer suffocating terror of their impending doom, they broke violently into the Grand Saloon's lavish liquor cabinets. They drank heavily, dulling their minds to the freezing reality of the ocean. And then the madness truly took hold. They began to loot the empty cabins, violently stealing heavy lifebelts from weaker passengers, and as the ship began its final fatal descent, this drunken, violent mob prepared to exact whatever monstrous desires they wished, knowing there would be absolutely no consequences on the bottom of the sea. As the stern of the mighty Arctic settled ever deeper into the freezing black waters of the North Atlantic, the violent, drunken mob that had raided the Grand Saloon turned their bloodshot eyes toward the final, desperate hope on the dying deck. Fourth Officer Francis Dorian, a man of unshakable loyalty and iron will, stood with a handful of brave souls frantically lashing together a massive wooden raft. They had torn the heavy doors from their iron hinges and dragged the massive wooden spars across the sloping, slippery deck, binding them tightly with thick ropes. It was a macabre, primitive vessel being built upon the rotting corpse of a luxury titan. But as the raft neared completion, the terrified, violent mob abandoned their looting and rushed the makeshift wooden platform. They charged through the freezing mist like wild, rabid animals, trampling the innocent, pushing the weeping women aside, and violently assaulting the men who had just built the raft. The deck devolved into a horrific, bloody massacre. Fourth Officer Dorian and his loyal men raised their heavy boarding axes, swinging the sharp steel against their own crewmates in a desperate bid to protect the innocent. But the crush of panicked, desperate bodies was simply too overwhelming. Under the sheer, violent weight of the mob, the heavy wooden raft broke completely free from its moorings. It slid violently down the sloping deck and crashed into the churning, freezing ocean, carrying several of the violent mutineers with it, leaving the weeping families completely stranded on the dying ship. While the violent, bloody chaos consumed the aft deck, a solitary, haunting rhythm continued to echo through the blinding white fog. Boom! A heavy, deafening shockwave that rattled the splintering oak timbers. Boom! A desperate, lonely plea for salvation fired into the absolute nothingness of the North Atlantic. It was the ship's heavy signal cannon, and standing faithfully beside it, enveloped in thick white smoke and freezing mist, was a young engineer apprentice named Stuart Holland. When the chaos had first erupted, Captain Luce had tasked the young man with firing the cannon, hoping against all hope that a passing ship might hear their mechanical cries. Holland took the order as a sacred, unbreakable vow. As the lifeboats were violently stolen away, as the women and children were drowned, as the brave men were hacked down with axes, the young engineer never once abandoned his post. He meticulously packed the black powder, loaded the heavy charges, and pulled the lanyard over and over again, his face stained with soot and his hands numb from the biting cold. The freezing black water was now visibly creeping up the sloping wooden deck, slowly inching its way toward his boots. A passing officer, fleeing the rising ocean, desperately urged the young man to run, to try and find a piece of floating debris before the ship went under. But Stuart Holland simply shook his head. His supposed last words were a quiet, brave request directed to his captain, asking him to let the world know that at least one man stood by his post until the very end.
The heroism of that dark afternoon was not confined to the men. Deep within the shadows of the tilting, groaning deck, a lone woman was fighting her own impossible war against the abyss. Anna Downer, one of the ship's 2 stewardesses, stood at one of the heavy cast-iron hand pumps. long after the wealthy male passengers had collapsed from absolute exhaustion, and long after the rogue crewman had violently fled, Anna remained. The freezing sea spray whipped across her pale face, soaking her heavy wool dress until it weighed her down like a suit of iron. The wooden handle of the heavy pump was slick with bright red blood. Her hands had been rubbed completely raw, the skin torn and blistered, the blood dripping slowly down her freezing arms and staining the wet deck below. Captain Luce, conducting his final agonizing rounds of the dying ship, walked over to the shivering woman. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder and told her, with profound, heartbreaking sorrow, that she could leave her post. There was no use working the pumps anymore. The ship was sinking far too fast, and the ocean had already won. But Anna Downer looked at her broken captain, her eyes filled with a quiet, terrifying resolve. She told him that as long as her arms still worked, she would stand by that pump and fight the water. And so she did, continuing her bloody, rhythmic labor until the dark, freezing ocean finally rose up and swallowed her whole.
With every single avenue of escape entirely exhausted, Captain Luce realized the final agonizing moment was rapidly approaching. The Arctic was groaning in pure structural agony, her massive oak timbers shrieking as the immense pressure of the ocean began to crush her lower decks. The captain walked slowly through the freezing mist, handing out the last remaining heavy cork lifebelts to the weeping passengers. He stopped to spend a quiet, heartbreaking moment with the elite families, the Collins, the Browns, and the Allens. The children clung desperately to their mothers' heavy winter coats, their small faces pale and terrified, as the families huddled together and prayed into the silence. With his duty to his passengers completely fulfilled, Captain Luce finally turned and walked down the slanted, slippery wooden corridor toward his own private cabin. Lying in the small bed, shivering from his lifelong illness, was his 11-year-old son, Willie. The captain gathered the fragile boy into his strong arms, wrapping him tightly in a thick wool blanket. He carried his son up the steep, tilting stairs to the open bridge of the dying Titan. The captain saw absolutely no chance of survival for either of them. The freezing water and the violent suction of the sinking ship would surely drag them down into the dark. He held his son tightly against his chest, shielding the boy's eyes from the horrors of the deck. Together, father and son stood in the freezing fog, completely silent, waiting for the great ship to take her final plunge into the abyss. As young Stuart Holland fired his final deafening blast from the signal cannon, the massive lower decks of the Arctic finally blew through with a catastrophic thunderous roar, and the towering wooden bow lifted violently into the grey sky. The moment the Arctic slipped beneath the freezing surface, the world of the living was instantly replaced by a roaring, chaotic abyss. The sheer, massive bulk of the wooden Titan created a terrifying, violent vortex as it plunged toward the ocean floor, dragging hundreds of helpless, screaming souls down with it. Captain Luce held his young son, Willie, with all the desperate strength a father could muster, wrapping his arms tightly around the frail boy as the black water violently consumed them. The roar of the ocean was deafening, a crushing physical pressure that pushed the air from their lungs and plunged them into absolute freezing darkness. They were pulled deeper and deeper, tumbling violently in the suffocating churn of splintered wood, heavy rigging, and drowning bodies. The ocean was a merciless, twisting washing machine of freezing terror. Luce fought with every ounce of his remaining strength to kick upward, to pull his child back to the air, but the suction of the dying Leviathan was simply too immense. In the chaotic, violent thrashing of the deep water, a heavy piece of unseen debris struck them in the dark, and the captain's grip was violently broken. He felt his son slip from his arms, torn away into the freezing black void. Luce scrambled blindly in the water, his hands grasping at the empty, freezing current, but Willie was gone, and the captain, his lungs burning with the desperate need for air, was forced to kick toward the faint, pale light of the surface alone.
Captain Luce broke the surface of the Atlantic with a violent, ragged gasp, his lungs screaming as the freezing autumn air rushed back into his chest. But the world he returned to was a vision of absolute, unadulterated hell. The grand, towering Arctic was completely gone, swallowed entirely by the deep. In her place was a massive, violently churning debris field spread across the rolling black swells, and floating amidst the splintered oak and torn canvas were hundreds of terrified, freezing people. The blinding white fog still hung heavily over the water, trapping the survivors in a claustrophobic sensory nightmare. The air was filled with a chorus of agonizing screams, a deafening, heartbreaking cacophony of drowning men, women, and children begging for salvation. People clung desperately to whatever they could find: heavy wooden doors, empty wooden casks, shattered spars, and broken chairs. The freezing temperature of the water immediately began to drain the life from their bodies, their limbs growing numb and heavy as the dark ocean pulled at their saturated clothes. Luce wiped the freezing salt water from his eyes, treading water in the chaotic swell, and desperately scanned the horrific scene. His heart pounded against his ribs as he searched the sea of screaming faces, looking for the small, frail figure of his son. Against all odds, through the thick mist and the churning foam, he spotted Willie at a distance, struggling weakly in the freezing water. The captain immediately began to swim toward him, a desperate surge of adrenaline pushing through his freezing veins.
But as Captain Luce fought his way through the freezing swells toward his drowning son, the ocean delivered its final, most grotesque act of violence. When the Arctic had collided with the Vesta hours earlier, the heavy wooden starboard paddle box had been severely damaged and splintered. Now, deep beneath the surface, as the massive wooden hull crashed violently against the ocean floor, that massive, heavy wooden housing broke completely free from the wreck. Released from the immense weight of the ship, the colossal wooden structure, the size of a small house, shot upward through the water like a massive, unguided missile. It burst through the surface of the ocean with a terrifying, deafening roar, launching high into the freezing air. The massive wooden box crashed back down directly into the thickest part of the struggling survivors. It was a horrific, indiscriminate slaughter. The heavy oak timbers struck those in the water with bone-crushing force, killing several people instantly. And in a twist of fate so cruel it defies all comprehension, the massive falling wooden structure crashed down directly upon young Willie. The captain watched in absolute paralyzed horror as the heavy timber struck his child, instantly ending his short, tragic life. The paddle box then slammed violently into Captain Luce himself, a thick wooden beam striking him squarely in the head with sickening force. The impact nearly knocked him unconscious, but the freezing, biting water shocked him back to reality. His son was gone, brutally taken by the very ship he had commanded.
Stunned, bleeding heavily from the brutal wound on his head, and entirely broken in spirit, Captain Luce allowed the churning ocean waves to push him against the side of the massive, floating paddle box. His vision blurred as the warm blood ran down his freezing face, mixing with the salt water. With the very last ounces of his fading strength, he pulled himself up onto the splintered wooden planks. He lay there on his stomach, shivering violently, coughing up black seawater as the realization of his absolute failure crushed whatever remained of his soul. Slowly, a few other desperate, freezing men managed to drag themselves out of the churning water and onto the makeshift, blood-stained raft. Among them was George Allen, the wealthy executive from the Novelty Iron Works, who had just watched his wife and infant child slip beneath the waves to their deaths. The small group of 12 survivors huddled tightly together on the splintered wood, their heavy clothes soaked and freezing to their skin in the biting autumn wind. From their precarious perch on the massive wooden box, they were forced to bear witness to the prolonged, agonizing end of those still trapped in the water. The screams slowly began to fade, replaced by a haunting, gurgling silence as the freezing ocean claimed the weak, the injured, and the exhausted. They watched the families of the elite, the Browns and the Allens, clinging to shattered pieces of debris, slowly freezing to death before their very eyes. The ship was gone, but the horrors of the North Atlantic were only just beginning. As the afternoon bled into a bruised, freezing twilight, the 12 desperate souls huddled atop the massive, splintered paddle box realized that surviving the immediate sinking was only the first chapter of their unimaginable nightmare. The massive wooden structure bobbed violently in the churning black swells, completely at the mercy of the vast, indifferent ocean. The thick, suffocating white fog that had shrouded the horrific collision began to slowly lift, only to be replaced by a howling, bitter autumn gale. The wind whipped violently across the surface of the open Atlantic, tearing the tops off the freezing waves and blasting the survivors with icy, stinging spray that felt like shattered glass against their skin. Captain Luce lay completely flat against the wet, heavy oak, the blood from the brutal head wound freezing solidly in his hair. He stared out across the churning, chaotic debris field, his mind fractured and bleeding from the brutal, sudden loss of his son. The men on the raft clung tightly to one another in a desperate bid for warmth, their heavy wool clothing, entirely saturated with freezing salt water, now acting like icy anchors rather than insulation. Every single time the massive paddle box dropped heavily into the trough of a deep wave, the freezing black water washed completely over them, threatening to pull the weakest and most injured among them back into the deep. There was absolutely no fresh water, no food of any kind, and absolutely no shelter from the biting, screaming wind that cut right to their bones. They were entirely exposed, clinging to a bloodied, splintered piece of wreckage in one of the most hostile, unforgiving environments on the face of the earth. And as the grey sky darkened into a terrifying twilight, a new, silent threat began to circle deep below them in the freezing water.
The catastrophic, violent sinking of the Grand Arctic and the violent, crushing release of the heavy wooden paddle box had left the freezing ocean heavily stained with blood. And in the deep, pitch-black waters of the North Atlantic, blood is a silent, undeniable magnetic call to the predators of the deep. It did not take long for them to arrive. Drawn from miles away by the metallic, heavy scent of death, the sharks began to silently circle the massive floating debris field. To the survivors, shivering uncontrollably on the paddle box, the horror was agonizingly, excruciatingly slow. They could not clearly see the beasts in the churning, dark water beneath them, but they could see the terrifying, bloody results of their arrival. Out on the vast periphery of the wreckage, where exhausted, freezing stragglers still clung desperately to small pieces of splintered wood or empty wooden casks, the agonizing screams for help would suddenly, violently stop. A panicked, frantic thrashing in the water, a sudden, violent pull downward beneath the foam, and then absolutely nothing but empty, freezing waves and a dark stain on the surface.
The men on the massive paddle box watched in absolute paralyzed horror as the helpless stragglers were quietly and brutally dragged down into the abyss one by one. There was absolutely nothing they could do to help their fellow passengers. The sea was far too rough, their bodies were completely drained of strength, and the predators were far too fast. They pulled their freezing, numb legs tighter against their chests, terrified that a rogue, crashing wave might wash them over the splintered edge and into the waiting, razor-sharp jaws below. The ocean had become a vast, open, liquid graveyard, and the scavengers were feeding eagerly in the darkening water.
Then the true, suffocating darkness finally fell. The pale sun slipped quietly below the horizon, plunging the freezing North Atlantic into an absolute impenetrable pitch black. There was no moon to guide them, no stars shining through the heavy gale, only the howling of the bitter wind and the terrifying, invisible roar of the crashing, heavy waves. For the shivering survivors on the wooden raft, the total loss of sight amplified the horror to a completely unbearable degree. It was a complete, freezing sensory deprivation chamber. They could no longer see the giant rolling waves before they struck. They only felt the sickening, violent drop of the raft into the trough, immediately followed by the crushing, suffocating impact of freezing water washing violently over their bodies. In the pitch black, the psychological torment slowly broke the minds of the weakest men aboard. The severe, creeping hypothermia began to quietly shut down their internal organs. The shivering became so intensely violent that it literally cracked their teeth, and then, terrifyingly, it simply stopped. A false, highly dangerous sensation of warmth would spread through their dying, frozen bodies, and they would begin to vividly hallucinate in the dark. Men muttered nonsense to themselves in the freezing wind, calling out warmly to wives and children who were already lying dead on the bottom of the sea hours ago. And one by one, in the freezing, absolute darkness, the men on the raft began to die. Some simply closed their heavy eyes and slipped into a permanent freezing sleep, while others, driven completely and utterly mad by the trauma of the sea, quietly let go of the heavy oak timbers and slid away into the black water, never making a single sound as the freezing ocean swallowed them whole.
When the pale, bruised, grey light of dawn finally broke across the churning, empty horizon, the true, horrific toll of the freezing night was revealed in the brutal morning light. Of the 12 desperate men who had painfully climbed onto the massive wooden paddle box the afternoon before, only a mere fraction remained breathing. The bodies of those who had quietly frozen to death in the pitch-black night still lay stiffly on the splintered wood, their skin a pale, terrifying blue, their eyes frozen wide open, staring blankly up at the heavy grey sky. Captain Luce, George Allen, and a small handful of others forced their stiff, freezing limbs to move, painfully pushing the heavy corpses of their former companions over the splintered edge of the wood, watching them sink silently and quickly into the dark, freezing water. It was a morbid, deeply traumatizing, but absolutely necessary task to make room on the shrinking, battered raft. As they weakly scanned the horizon, they saw other makeshift rafts drifting hopelessly in the distance. George Allen was forced to watch helplessly as the family of James Brown and the remaining members of his own family clung to a shattered, floating piece of the ship's deck, slowly dying of exposure right before his very eyes, completely out of reach. The ocean was vast, terribly empty, and completely devoid of any rescue ships. The gale continued to howl without mercy, whipping the sea into a violent frenzy. The massive wooden paddle box, though incredibly buoyant, was slowly beginning to break apart under the relentless, crushing pounding of the heavy waves. The remaining survivors were severely dehydrated, their lips cracked and bleeding, their minds slipping in and out of a freezing, torturous delirium. They had miraculously survived the night, but they all knew, deep in their freezing bones, that they could not survive another. The second day upon the freezing, splintered paddle box brought no salvation, only a terrifying, agonizing clarity to the true extent of their absolute isolation. As the bruised grey light of morning crept across the vast rolling expanse of the North Atlantic, the surviving men could finally see the horrifying emptiness of the world. The massive wooden housing they clung to was rapidly deteriorating, its thick iron bolts groaning and popping under the relentless crushing weight of the heavy ocean swells. The salt water had thoroughly saturated every layer of their heavy wool clothing, drawing the last reserves of body heat from their violently shivering frames. For one of the men, a hardened sailor who had bravely pulled the lone French fisherman from the churning water just a day prior, the sheer psychological torture of the abyss became entirely too much to bear. The deafening roar of the wind and the freezing, endless horizon shattered his mind completely. Driven completely mad by the cold and the terrifying despair of the open ocean, he began to thrash violently against the heavy wooden timbers, screaming incoherently into the white mist. He tried to throw himself over the splintered edge of the raft, desperate to let the freezing dark water consume him and end the agonizing, drawn-out torment. Captain Luce and George Allen, despite their own severe injuries and near-paralyzing exhaustion, were forced to physically restrain the man, pinning his shivering, broken body against the bloody wood to keep the sea from claiming him. While the innocent men on the paddle box slowly froze to death, a sickening, deeply unjust salvation was taking place miles away. Out in the grey, rolling swells, the Canadian bark Huron, en route to Quebec, was carefully picking its way through the dense fog. The lookouts on the Huron spotted a small, fragile wooden shape bobbing violently in the distance. It was the lifeboat commanded by 4th Officer Francis Dorian, the brave man who had fought to the bitter end to build the makeshift raft. The Canadian sailors quickly pulled the 30 exhausted, freezing survivors from the wooden boat, wrapping them in thick, dry blankets and providing them with warm food and shelter. Shortly after, the Hurons stumbled upon the remains of the massive, improvised raft that the violent mob had violently stolen from the dying ship. It had broken into several pieces under the crushing weight of the ocean, the violent mutineers having paid the ultimate price for their cowardice. Only one single survivor remained clinging to the splintered wood, completely broken and terrified, and he too was pulled from the freezing abyss. But this rescue highlighted the dark, horrifying reality of the tragedy. The men who had fought with axes to steal the means of escape, the men who had abandoned the weeping women and children to a freezing death, were now sitting in the warm, dry belly of a rescue ship, sipping hot tea while their captain bled on a piece of wreckage.
As the Canadian bark Huron continued its journey with the survivors aboard, an incredibly fascinating and revealing encounter took place. Out in the heavy autumn mist, the Huron crossed paths with another vessel, a ship called the Lebanon, which was sailing directly for the port of New York. The captains of the two ships communicated through the fog, and a unique opportunity was presented to the survivors of the Arctic. The Lebanon offered to take any of the rescued men directly back to America, to their homes and their waiting families, rather than forcing them to sail all the way north to Canada. The choice made by the survivors in that moment spoke volumes about the guilt they carried in their hearts. The men who had acted nobly during the terrifying ordeal, 4th Officer Dorian and the few loyal passengers, immediately accepted the offer, boarding the Lebanon to return to New York and face the music. But the others, the rogue firemen, the mutinous sailors, and the men who knew exactly what they had done in the dark, refused. Paralyzed by the heavy, suffocating weight of their own cowardice and terrified of the violent, angry reception they would surely face when the American public learned they had left every woman and child to drown, they chose to stay hiding aboard the Huron.
They sailed quietly to Canada, disappearing into the cold north, forced to live out the rest of their days haunted by the screaming ghosts of the innocent souls they had so brutally betrayed. But miles away, completely unaware that rescue ships were operating in the same waters, Captain Luce and his small band of survivors were slowly losing their battle against the freezing deep. The second afternoon wore on, bringing with it a creeping, terrifying lethargy. The violent shivering that had racked their bodies for over 24 hours began to subside, replaced by a heavy, toxic numbness. George Allen lay quietly against the splintered wood, staring blankly at the grey sky, his mind undoubtedly replaying the horrific, agonizing image of his wife and child slipping beneath the freezing waves. Captain Luce, his head wound crusted with dark, frozen blood, drifted in and out of a freezing delirium. He saw phantom ships in the thick mist, massive, silent vessels with towering sails that seemed to glide effortlessly through the fog, only to dissolve into nothingness when he blinked his heavy eyes. At one point, a genuine silhouette did appear on the horizon, a distant ship cutting through the waves. The men on the paddle box tried to scream, tried to wave their freezing, bloody hands in the air to signal for help, but their voices were entirely swallowed by the roaring wind, and their movements were far too weak to be seen over the massive swells. The ship simply sailed past them, oblivious to their suffering, leaving them behind to face the terrifying prospect of a second, completely unsurvivable night in the pitch black. The sun began to dip toward the horizon once again, casting long, dark shadows over the water and preparing to plunge them back into the freezing hell of the abyss. The second night descended upon the shattered paddle box like a heavy, suffocating shroud, plunging the freezing survivors back into a world of absolute, impenetrable darkness. The wind howled with a renewed, vicious intensity, whipping the black swells into towering mountains of freezing water that crashed violently over the splintered wood. Captain Luce and George Allen clung to the thick oak timbers with hands that no longer felt like flesh and blood, but stiff, frozen claws locked into the grain of the wood. The heavy iron bolts holding the massive wooden structure together were screaming in the dark, popping and snapping under the immense crushing pressure of the restless ocean. The men knew with terrifying certainty that the makeshift raft would not survive another full day in this violent, churning hell, and neither would they. The severe, creeping lethargy of hypothermia had deeply infiltrated their organs, slowing their heartbeats to a fragile, sluggish crawl. They lay completely flat against the freezing wood, their eyes closed against the biting salt spray, waiting quietly for the ocean to finally reach up and pull them down into the silent deep. The agonizing hours bled together in the pitch black, a continuous freezing torture where the line between life and death blurred into a terrifying hallucinatory gray. They were ghosts already, their bodies shutting down piece by piece, merely waiting for the sea to formally claim them in the dark. When the bruised, pale light of the third morning finally crept across the vast, rolling expanse of the Atlantic, the wind began to slowly, mercifully die down. The towering, violent swells flattened into a heavy, rolling grey glass, and the thick, suffocating fog finally began to lift, revealing the true, terrifying emptiness of the ocean. Of the 12 men who had originally climbed onto the paddle box, only 3 remained breathing. Captain Luce, the wealthy George Allen, and the young sailor who had saved the French fisherman hours before. They were barely alive, their skin horrifying translucent grey, their lips cracked and bleeding, their heavy wool coats frozen stiff to their emaciated bodies. As Luce slowly lifted his heavy, bleeding head, his blurred, salt-stung eyes caught a dark shape on the distant horizon. It was not a phantom of the mist, it was a ship. The thick black smoke from its single funnel trailed across the gray sky like a ribbon of salvation. It was the Cunard steamer, the Cambria. The three freezing men tried desperately to shout, but their throats were entirely raw and voiceless. The young sailor, using the absolute last reserve of his fading strength, managed to pry a splintered piece of wood loose and wave a torn, soaked rag high into the freezing air. For an agonizing, breathless eternity, the massive black ship continued its course, and then, ever so slowly, it began to turn.
The massive iron-hulled Cambria sliced through the heavy grey swells, bearing down upon the shattered, bloody remains of the paddle box. The freezing men looked up at the towering black hull of the British steamer, tears of absolute broken relief freezing instantly on their pale cheeks. Sailors aboard the Cambria carefully lowered heavy ropes and wooden baskets down to the churning water, gently pulling the three broken survivors from the very edge of the abyss. They were hauled up onto the warm, dry deck, immediately wrapped in thick wool blankets and given warm spirits to revive their dangerously slow hearts. But the true, breathtaking poetry of this rescue lay completely hidden in the identity of the man who commanded the British vessel. The Cambria belonged to the Cunard line, the fierce, bitter arch-nemesis of the American Collins line. Yet the master of the Cambria, Captain Russell, did not view the broken American captain as a rival. He viewed him as a brother. Years prior, Captain Russell had been caught in a catastrophic, deadly storm. His own ship, the bark Jesse Stevens, had sunk into the freezing depths, and he, along with 16 of his crew, had been miraculously saved by a mighty Collins Line steamer named the Pacific. The British captain had carried a deep personal debt in his heart for years, and on this freezing, tragic morning, the ocean had delivered the perfect, poetic opportunity to repay it.
Captain Russell treated the broken American survivors with the utmost reverence and care, providing them with warm cabins, hot food, and the heavy, silent comfort that only a fellow mariner could truly understand. As the Cambria continued to slowly sweep the massive floating debris field, they managed to pull a small handful of other desperate stragglers from the freezing water. Incredibly, among them was the lone French fisherman from the Vesta, the man who had miraculously survived being violently pulled through the Arctic's massive paddle wheel. But as the hours passed and the churning ocean offered up nothing more than splintered wood and empty lifebelts, the terrifying heavy truth finally settled over Captain Luce. He sat quietly in his warm cabin, staring blankly at the dark wooden floor. The Cambria was safe and he was alive, but the cost was entirely unimaginable. His beloved son, Willie, was lying at the bottom of the ocean. His magnificent ship, the pride of the American nation, was gone, and hundreds of innocent souls, women and children who had trusted him to guide them safely through the dark, had been brutally swallowed by the freezing abyss. The physical rescue was complete, but the deep psychological horror of the SS Arctic was permanently etched into his fractured soul. The Cambria blew its heavy steam whistle, a long, mournful cry that echoed across the empty ocean, and turned her bow toward home, leaving the vast, unmarked graveyard behind. While Captain Luce lay broken and bleeding in the warm cabin of a British rescue ship, and hundreds of his passengers lay dead in the freezing darkness of the Atlantic, a profoundly shocking and deeply ironic twist of fate was unfolding miles away. When the massive wooden hull of the Arctic had violently trampled the smaller French steamer, the Vesta, Captain Luce had looked back into the blinding fog and assumed the terribly mangled iron ship was sinking into the abyss. It was the very reason he had ordered his own dying ship to turn around. But the Vesta did not sink. The French vessel was decades ahead of the Arctic in terms of survival technology. She was built of heavy iron, and more importantly, her lower decks were divided into 4 thick, watertight bulkheads. Although her bow was completely crushed, shredded, and painted with the blood of her own crew, those heavy iron walls held firmly against the crushing pressure of the freezing ocean. For hours after the violent collision, the French crew had truly believed they were doomed, working frantically in the freezing mist to stabilize their heavily bleeding ship. But through an absolute miracle of seamanship and the unyielding strength of modern engineering, they managed to keep the Vesta afloat. The crippled, headless iron ship limped painfully through the rolling swells, slowly making her way toward the rocky, desolate coast of Newfoundland, entirely unaware of the monstrous tragedy she had left in her wake.
When the heavily damaged Vesta finally limped into the safe, quiet harbor of St. John's, Newfoundland, she brought with her a terrifying and completely false narrative. As the French crew tied off their battered vessel, the local authorities and dock workers stared in absolute shock at the violently shredded iron bow. When asked what kind of monster could have inflicted such catastrophic damage, the French captain could only report what he had seen. He told them that a massive American paddle steamer, a titan of the Collins line, had violently rammed them in the thick fog and then simply steamed away at full speed into the white mist. To the crew of the Vesta, the mighty Arctic had committed a cowardly, ruthless hit-and-run, abandoning a small fishing vessel to die in the freezing water. Word began to spread rapidly from the port. Telegraph lines hummed with the shocking news that Captain James Luce, a highly respected American mariner, had acted as a villain on the high seas. The world firmly believed that the Arctic was perfectly safe, that she had merely scratched her thick wooden paint and was steaming proudly toward New York, leaving the French to drown. For several days, the public outrage grew against the American captain, completely and utterly unaware that the man they were condemning was currently drifting on a bloody piece of splintered wood, and that his beautiful, unsinkable ship was already a shattered tomb, resting on the bottom of the ocean.
But the comfortable, self-righteous anger in St. John's was about to be violently shattered by the arrival of ghosts from the fog. 2 days after the catastrophic collision, 2 small, battered wooden lifeboats finally bumped against the rocky shoreline at Broad Cove, a desolate stretch of the Newfoundland coast. The exhausted, freezing men dragged their heavy boats onto the cold stones and began the arduous 50-mile journey north to the city of St. John's. It was the lifeboat commanded by the cowardly second officer Ballum and the boat hijacked by the mutinous ship's engineers. They had rowed for days through the biting gale, believing they were the sole survivors of the greatest maritime disaster in American history. But when Ballum and his rogue crew finally reached the bustling harbor of St. John's, they were met with a sight that must have frozen the very blood in their veins. Sitting safely in the docks, heavily damaged but entirely afloat, was the Vesta, the very ship that had ripped their wooden Leviathan apart. The ship they had assumed was resting at the bottom of the sea was safe. And as the mutinous crew stepped onto the docks, they found themselves facing the severe, questioning eyes of the port authorities. They now had to explain to the world why they, the strong, able-bodied crewmen of the Arctic, had arrived in heavily stocked lifeboats without a single weeping woman, without a single shivering child, and without their captain.
Realizing they were standing on the absolute precipice of the gallows, Second Officer Balaam and the mutinous crewmen quickly and maliciously spun a dark web of deceit.
To protect themselves from the devastating consequences of their own violent cowardice, they carefully tailored a story that completely condemned Captain Luce. When questioned by the authorities as to why he had rowed away from a dying ship, leaving hundreds of innocent souls trapped on the sloping deck, Balaam lied. He claimed that Captain Luce had completely lost his mind in the chaos, that the captain was entirely incapable of leading, that his judgment was deeply flawed, and that staying by the ship would have been a useless suicide mission. The rogue firemen and engineers fiercely backed up the story, painting themselves as the desperate, tragic victims of a madman's sinking ship. They claimed that they had been ordered away, or that they had barely escaped the violent panic with their own lives, deferring all the horrific judgment away from their own violent, bloody mutinies. And because Captain Luce was presumed dead at the bottom of the Atlantic, there was no one left to defend his honor or to tell the true horrific story of the men who had hacked at passengers with axes to steal the lifeboats. Meanwhile, the sprawling metropolis of New York City waited in absolute ignorance. The Collins Line officers expected their proud ship to arrive at any moment, completely unaware that the grim, terrifying truth was slowly making its way down the coast, a truth that would soon plunge an entire nation into a deep, inescapable mourning.
For 2 agonizing, silent weeks, the sprawling metropolis of New York City waited in absolute ignorance for their grand Leviathan to come home. The officers of the Collins Line were completely oblivious to the horrific tragedy that had unfolded in the freezing fog of the North Atlantic, but the ocean cannot keep its dark secrets forever. On October 10th, the first faint, terrifying rumors began to whisper through the bustling cobblestone streets. At first, no one believed it. The SS Arctic was the absolute pinnacle of American engineering, a colossal wooden titan that was widely considered to be entirely unsinkable. But as the days passed, the horrifying reality slowly materialized. The survivors who had been rescued by the British steamer Cambria and the Canadian bark Huron finally began to trickle back into the country, arriving like hollow, frozen ghosts returning from the grave. And with them came the grim, terrifying details of the sinking. The public outrage that had initially been directed at Captain Luce for a cowardly hit-and-run completely evaporated, replaced by a sickening, paralyzing wave of national grief. When the few honorable survivors, including the broken Captain Luce himself, stepped onto American soil, the malicious, self-serving lies spun by Second Officer Balaam and the mutinous crewmen in Newfoundland were entirely unraveled. The world finally learned the true, horrific story of the men who had hacked at their own passengers with axes, the cowards who had stolen the lifeboats, and the hundreds of innocent souls who had been violently abandoned to the freezing abyss. The cold, brutal mathematics of the disaster sent a profound shockwave of horror through the entire nation. Of the 408 terrified souls who had sailed aboard the Grand Arctic, approximately 88 survived. The freezing ocean had claimed 320 lives, and the most horrifying, sickening statistic of all was that among the survivors there was not a single woman and not a single child. Every last one of them had been swallowed by the dark water. The elite families who had financed and built the grand ship were absolutely devastated by their own creation. Edward Collins, the proud owner of the shipping line, was completely destroyed. He had lost half of his family in the freezing water, and the immense grief would violently shadow him for the rest of his life. James Brown, the wealthy bank president, lost 6 of his family members to the deep. and George Allen, who had survived the freezing nights on the bloody paddle box, was forced to live with the agonizing memory of watching his wife and infant child die. These powerful men of industry, who had built empires of iron and steam, were reduced to broken, hollow shells, suffering from severe, crippling depression that no amount of wealth could ever cure. The American public wept for the lost innocents, but that grief quickly turned to a burning, violent demand for justice. They wanted the mutinous sailors, the rogue firemen, and the cowardly engineers to hang for their crimes on the high seas.
But true justice, much like the sunken Arctic, proved to be an elusive ghost. Despite the massive, horrific loss of life, no formal government inquiry was ever held in Washington. The politicians, the very men who had forced the impossible, lethal requirement of steaming at full speed through blinding fog, quietly swept their own culpability under the rug. Fearing the severe political backlash that would inevitably come if the public realized the government's speed mandate had doomed the ship, they simply allowed the disaster to fade from the official records. Captain James Luce, deeply traumatized and carrying the heavy, unbreakable guilt of losing his son and his passengers, never returned to the sea. He lived out the rest of his days quietly on land, haunted by the roaring of the ocean. And in a breathtaking, almost sickening display of corporate rivalry, how did the Cunard Line react to the violent death of their American competitor? Only a few days after the tragic news reached New York, plunging the city into deep mourning, Cunard organized a massive public parade straight down the streets of the city. They marched proudly to celebrate and coldly advertise the safety and security of their own lifeboats. It was a grim, heartless capitalization on the slaughter of hundreds, a stark reminder that in the bitter war for ocean supremacy, human life was merely a fragile, expendable commodity.
Today, the massive wooden bones of the SS Arctic lie somewhere in the pitch-black, freezing depths off the desolate coast of Newfoundland. Her resting place is entirely unmarked, a silent, forgotten tomb, heavily shrouded by the crushing weight of the Atlantic. Because she was built of thick oak rather than heavy iron, the ocean has likely reclaimed her entirely, her grand saloons and lavish cabins slowly disintegrating into nothingness over the past century and a half. The bodies of the 320 souls who perished were never recovered from the deep. The name Arctic was viewed as deeply cursed, completely avoided by all shipping lines in the years to come. Even the famous White Star Line, decades later, considered naming one of their grand vessels the Arctic, but quickly opted for Celtic when quietly reminded of this bloody, cowardly history. It is an era of maritime history that has mostly been swallowed by time, a terrifying testament to what happens when human arrogance and greed collide with the primal, unforgiving power of nature, and a haunting reminder of how quickly the thin veil of morality can violently tear away in the freezing dark. Thank you for joining me in the dreamscape of history. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the shadows of the past, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us uncover more forgotten horrors. Let me know down in the comments what terrified you the most about this tragedy. Until next time, keep the lights dim and listen closely to the fog.